I've come out to Dallas today to show you the graves of Bonnie and Clyde. Now, I'm nowhere near the same kind of historian for Bonnie and Clyde as I am for Bush Cassidy, but I figured that while I was in town, I might as well show you some of the sites associated with their life, because the city is slowly tearing down all of what remains. But the graves, lucky for us, won't be going anywhere anytime soon. And in West Dallas, which is where the poorest of the poor in that city, the squatters, lived, you find the grave section for the Barrow family. And here is Clyde and Marvin Barrow, who are buried next to their brothers. And this is Bonnie and Clyde. The photos here were actually found by the police and distributed to the media, which made this couple incredibly famous overnight. And I kind of wanted to show you some other people who are buried alongside him, without giving too much of the history.
In every mother's lap, there sits a future president, and no father ever dreamed that the little fellow holding his hand would ever become a gangster. And yet, it is the paradox of life that from the day your child comes into this world, a million conflicting influences begin to mold his character. The soul of that child becomes a battleground on which God and the devil fight for final victory. It is to be hoped that Clyde's younger brother, who is here shown attempting to console his mother, may yet vindicate the name of Barrow and make it stand for something in the community besides crime and murder. It is to be hoped that he will be able to withstand the temptation of easy money and the pleadings of the devil and bring some measure of sunshine and happiness to the lives of his aged parents in their declining years.
And this is actually Leon Barrow, Clyde's younger brother. Leon never really did get wrapped up in Clyde's dirty business. He was in jail a few times, but never for any violent crimes, mainly because the cops knew all the Barrow boys and wanted to bring one of them in, especially after the family became famous for Bonnie and Clyde. He became a retired trucker and eventually died and was buried in a different cemetery. But here is Cumi Barrow, Clyde's mother, and by all accounts, a good wife of a tenant farmer, Henry, who is, of course, buried right next to her. And Henry Barrow was the poorest of the poor. When he moved to Dallas, he began collecting scrap to provide for the family. And these folks lived in a squatter's village. And in fact, for the first little while they were in town, they literally had to upturn their cart and live underneath it. Such were the depths of poverty in West Dallas on the other side of the river. And here's Elvin Barrow. Now, the Barrows had 7 siblings. Clyde and Buck were both killed by the law, and 3 others were felons. Only Elvin and Leon stayed out of trouble. And this is kind of the entrance to the cemetery. You saw the earlier video. You turn in through this gate and left, and there it is. You really can't miss the graves of the Barrow family. And I'll show you a little bit. They are buried on opposite sides of the city. You can see the river is between them because the authorities really didn't want to bury Bonnie and Clyde together. For one, it would create a shrine, and secondly, they had killed a lot of lawmen. They had killed a whole lot of police and even a few innocent civilians, and so they wanted to separate them in death. And that is the way it's remained. It's also a class barrier, again, because West Dallas was seen as so far beneath the likes of Bonnie Parker. And she's buried here next to her mother in the shadow of the mausoleum. And when I came here, there was actually a large funeral procession, so I had to wait for them to leave, and I wish them the best in their final farewells to their loved ones. But this is Bonnie Parker's grave. As the flowers are all made sweeter by the sunshine and the dew, so this old world is made brighter by the lives of folks like you. And she's buried right next to her mother. I'll kind of pan around a little bit.
As far as is recorded, Bonnie Parker was the worst woman bandit since the days of Belle Starr. She is the only woman ever to be shot down by officers of the law in attempted capture. Bonnie's burial was attended only by close friends and relatives, which numbered about 150 people, including her sister, Billy Mace, who is now a prisoner of the law, charged with the killing of 2 state highway patrolmen, of which her sister Bonnie had already been accused. Billy Mace is attended at the funeral by 2 deputy sheriffs and a matron of the jail. Clyde Barrow's mother and father, seen in the foreground, and his brother, also pay their respects to the girl who was Clyde's only friend and who died by his side.
And it's interesting to think that Emma Parker actually lived into World War II but didn't see the end of it. A weird overlapping of basically Wild West and Great Depression history meets World War II. Bonnie Parker lived with her mom and worked for some time at Hargrave's Cafe when her bad boy boyfriends were on the lam. And one of her most common customers at that cafe was Ted Hinton, a postal worker buried on the left. In 1932, Hinton joined the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, and the Clyde Barker gang began their murderous spree throughout the Midwest. After killing several local cops, their reputation reached a status which would be impossible to repair, even among close friends like Hinton. He eventually would actually go on to serve in the posse that would kill the couple in Louisiana. And would you just look at the sad state of the old Hargrave Cafe? It was here that Bonnie Parker was working as a waitress, waiting for her boyfriend, Clyde Barrow, to get out of jail. And she met a local man who worked for the post office named Ted Hinton. And starting around 1932, the two struck up a friendship, and Ted heard about the struggles of Clyde Barker. So he befriended the Barker family as well. And when the Bonnie and Clyde gang began their Midwest murder spree, he was the police officer because he had recently taken up a job for the sheriff's department who knew the two the best. And he started working with the sheriff to try to apprehend them. And the families didn't even hold this against him. In fact, after the two were apprehended and killed in Louisiana in that shootout, he made sure that the families weren't exploited by the penny novels and the exploitative media at the time, who would have loved to turn this into another Machine Gun Kelly and sell a bunch of B-list movies and magazines on it. Well, he was the last member of that posse to die in 1977, and he lived as full a life as anybody else in that posse. He even went on to train Army Air Corps soldiers as pilots and owned a myriad of businesses around town. And you can see Dallas nowadays is a very different place than Dallas in 1932. And this is actually the grave of Blanche. Now, again, as I said before, I'm not as big of a buff for Bonnie and Clyde as I am for Wild West history, so I might butcher some of the details here. As far as I remember, she was a very reluctant accomplice, sort of along for the ride with her boyfriend at the time, Buck Barrow, who was Clyde's older brother. Everyone loved Buck Barrow. Clyde looked up to him, but he'd been shot. And as the police raised a camera to take a picture of her, she thought they were pulling out a gun to shoot her. She thought she was about to be executed on the spot, and she was traumatized because she just saw her boyfriend take several days to die. He was shot in the head. And up roll the police, and they pull out a black box, and she thinks she's about to be executed. And that photo of her became an infamous photo. Now, she did manage to go on and live a pretty full life. She lived up until 1988 with her husband, Eddie, and he was a World War II veteran. Again, an overlapping of two fascinating periods of American history. And this is Bob Elkhorn. He was an ambush man to the bottom right of the photo that I showed you earlier, and a friend of Hinton who was standing over him. This is another pilgrimage site for Bonnie and Clyde fans who visit Dallas. And this is the entrance into West Dallas. It's fascinating to think that back in the day, this would have been a shanty town. This was truly like walking across a border into just tenement houses and squats. Up until a few years ago, the place that's now the Helping Hand Market Garden was 105 Herbert Street, and most historians say that they actually met here on January 5th, 1930, at the home of one of Clyde Barrow's friends, a man named Clarence Clay. Apparently, Bonnie was chatting up Clarence, but as soon as Clyde walked in, the rest was history. At the time, Barrow was 20 and Bonnie was 19, and very sadly, the building was left abandoned for a very long period of time, and eventually they demolished it and made way for a garden here, which is still pretty nice, but most of the homes on this block date from the 1930s. And you can tell we're here in West Dallas, over the river from downtown Dallas, where they kept the poorer people, the squatters. And even more tragedy for historians, to my right used to be Clyde Barrow's childhood home, but it's recently been cleared out to make way for a playground. So at least they're getting some use out of it, and it's not just a parking lot, because God knows Dallas has enough of those. This was at 3111 North Winnetka Avenue. This home belongs to Raymond Hamilton's sister, Lillian McBride. On January 6th, 1933, 2 years and 1 day to the date after the couple met, and only blocks away from the house they met at, which is also now torn down, Clyde Barrow left his home and stepped into a police ambush intended for a man named Odell Chambliss. Because he stepped into an ambush that wasn't designated for him and he fought back, and he did it pretty dang well, he became kind of a folk hero here in West Dallas. A shootout ensued, and during the fight, Clyde killed an officer named Malcolm Davis. Public opinion wasn't swayed yet because they believed it was the equivalent of someone fighting back against a no-knock warrant at the wrong house. And the final stop on our journey is the old Eagle Ford School, and it's one of the final places that is actually upkept pretty well. Up until recently, it was abandoned, and it was used by Bonnie Parker as her sort of becoming-of-age story. She married a teenager here named Roy Thornton as a very young girl, and eventually he kind of just abandoned her and became a criminal himself. He, of course, never reached the same fame as Bonnie and Clyde and was killed in a jailbreak in 1937. So there were a few years after Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down, which the media talked to Roy Thornton in. And he basically said, better to die in a hail of bullets than it is to go to prison in a place like this. And in fact, when Bonnie Parker died, she was still wearing Roy Thornton's wedding ring, which I'm sure she and Clyde Barrow laughed at a few times.